When you think of basketball, what comes to mind? For me, it's often that raw energy, a pickup game, or maybe that iconic image of a superstar rising from really humble beginnings. It's
Mm.
often been called the city game, right? Like a global language spoken on countless courts. But what if that familiar image is subtly but while profoundly changing? Something feels different about the game today, doesn't it? So today we're diving deep into a fascinating and frankly pretty provocative concept, the gentrification of basketball. Now, just to be clear, we're not talking about literal real estate here. Nope. Instead, it's a powerful metaphor for how the sport's demographics, its accessibility, and maybe even its very style of play are shifting under some significant economic and global pressures. For this deep dive, we've pulled insights from a really in-depth ebook. It's titled The Gentrification of Basketball, How the Game's Changing Demographics Reflect a Shifting Sport, and it brings together some compelling data, player insights, and critical analysis.
Right. And our mission today is to really unpack this concept for you. We're going to look at the numbers, the stats that reveal these pretty striking shifts. We'll explore the powerful forces driving them, and maybe particularly how basketball's institutions have perhaps inadvertently, contributed to these changes by prioritizing global expansion while kind of leaving American grassroots development to, well, commercial markets. And maybe most importantly, we'll hear directly from the players, the guys who live and breathe this game every single day. What's fascinating here is how all these shifts affect who gets to play, how they play, and what it really means for basketball's rich cultural identity and its future.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this. What does the data actually tell us? Who is playing at the highest levels of basketball right now? The numbers certainly paint a stark picture, don't they? They really underscore this whole gentrification narrative we're exploring. Let's start with the NBA's racial makeup. Back in 2004, nearly 85% of NBA players were Black American.
85%. Wow.
Yeah. Fast forward to 2023, and that figure has dropped significantly, down to about 70%. And get this, that decline is actually even steeper if you just look at players specifically born in the U.S.
So what's the immediate takeaway? The big, stark one from those numbers.
Yeah.
It's that the traditional pipeline, the one that famously fed the NBA from American inner cities, it seems to be visibly narrowing for Black American players.
Yeah.
While at the same time, the international one is just exploding.
Exactly.
And this isn't just like a statistical quirk. It directly raises questions about who gets the opportunity to play at the elite level and the potential impact on the sport's whole cultural identity. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's really about whether those pathways, the ones that produce so many legends, are becoming harder to access.
And it's not just the NBA, right? Look at the international surge just across the board. Back in the early 90s, there were only, maybe 24 foreign-born players in the entire league, like 5 or 6%.
Tiny, yeah.
By the current season, that number has absolutely exploded. We're talking over 120 international players.
125, I think, was the latest number.
125, making up nearly 30% of the league from over 40 different countries. It's an all-time high. And, if you've been following the league, the last 5 MVP trophies, all won by foreign-born players, Giannis, Jokic, Embiid.
Undeniable impact.
We see similar trends, too, in NCAA Division I men's basketball. Around 2010, roughly 60% of DI men's players were Black. By the early 2020s, that number dipped to about 57%.
Still the majority, but a noticeable dip.
Definitely. And international players in Division I, they've more than doubled in the last 15 years or so, making up about 14% of players in the recent March Madness tournament. And even among the American-born players, we're seeing another subtle shift. A growing proportion seem to be coming from middle-class or, more affluent backgrounds. Consider this. The number of active NBA players whose fathers also played in the NBA jumped from just 10 back in 2009 to 35 last season.
Wow, that's a big jump. 35.
It is. And many young stars, like Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Jalen Brunson, great players, they grew up in comfortable suburbs or had that built-in NBA pedigree.
And this historical context is just so vital here. Basketball has this incredibly deep, iconic connection to Black American culture, to urban communities. So this shift isn't just about different faces on the court. It's about the very roots of the game in America. And you have to wonder, about the role of the institutions. While they're investing billions globally, fantastic for growing the game worldwide, but back here in the U.S., the grassroots system seems largely left to, commercial markets. And that inherently creates economic barriers for a lot of kids.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Let's dig into the core forces behind these demographic changes. Specifically, how economic and institutional factors right here in the U.S. are reshaping access to the game.
Yeah, this is key. One of the most significant factors is Frankly, the pervasive pay-to-play model that's just become dominant in the U.S. youth basketball scene. The path to success, more and more, runs through expensive AAU circuits. The Amateur Athletic Union, those competitive, privately funded club teams.
Right, the travel teams.
Exactly. Plus private training, exposure camps, it all ends up. A 2024 study by Dr. Nirav Pandya actually found that nearly half, 50%, of NBA players' AAU teams were based in top third affluent communities. The conclusion was pretty stark. The path to playing at the next level is, and I quote, predominantly available to those who can afford the considerable costs.
Wow, predominantly available.
Yeah. And the Aspen Institute's Project Play, they report that low-income children quit organized sports 6 times more often than affluent kids, specifically because of cost. Travel team fees alone can run into thousands of dollars. Jermaine O'Neal, the former NBA player, he observed that the rising costs are basically pricing out kids from the very communities that produced players like him.
So basketball, which used to be the ultimate accessible game ball hoop, it is now increasingly gate-kept by wealth.
That's the argument. The street court is kind of being replaced by the elite academy, and that fundamentally alters who gets the chance to develop.
And it's kind of ironic, too, isn't it? Like, urban gentrification itself seems to mean fewer public basketball courts in some areas. Those free training grounds are just disappearing. In Chicago, for instance, I read that 12 public courts were removed in rapidly gentrifying areas over the last decade.
Yeah, I saw that report. It forces kids to travel miles, assuming they even can, just to find a game.
So when those routes, those free, accessible spaces are cut, the pipeline from those communities, it just inevitably narrows, doesn't it?
It has to, and it feels like a direct consequence of, urban development, prioritizing certain things, maybe not public recreation, and perhaps basketball institutions haven't stepped in enough to fill that void. And this leads directly to the rise of these, professionalized youth systems.
The basketball academies.
Exactly. Programs like IMG Academy, Montverde Academy, even Jermaine O'Neal's new place, Dynamic Prep. They recruit nationally, internationally, but these often come with hefty price tags, tens of thousands a year, or they require families to relocate. It makes them accessible mostly to families with significant resources, or maybe the very top prospects who get shoe company sponsorships.
So the elite competition moves indoors to controlled, often affluent settings.
Right. It's a very different development environment compared to, say, the unstructured street ball that characterized earlier eras. It feels like a systemic shift away from that widely accessible community-based development. And it's arguably driven by the commercialization that basketball's pop institutions have, maybe implicitly, allowed to flourish in the U.S.
This all brings to mind a comparison I saw that really stuck with me. After a podcast in 2025 with LeBron James and Luka Doncic talking youth hoops, a TikTok comment went viral. It said, "Basketball is like golf now. It's a tutelage sport."
Huh. Golf. That's provocative.
Yeah. At first I chuckled, picturing hoopers in Argyle sweaters. But then you think about it, and the implications are serious. It suggests the game increasingly requires paid coaching, structured training, not just raw pickup games. LeBron himself contrasted his own upbringing. He said something like, "My basketball training was just being on the court. Let's just go hoop," with how his sons train now, much more structured.
Right. And Steve Nash, Hall of Famer Steve Nash, he lamented that the game has become a job for a lot of these kids so early.
Yeah.
Potentially trading, the joy of just playing for regimentation.
And does this shift in access tie into how the game itself is played now, the style?
I think it definitely does. The game has moved, stylistically, from maybe more individual creativity and raw physicality, think Michael Jordan, Allen Iverson, towards an emphasis on three-point shooting, spacing, efficiency. That's heavily influenced by analytics, sure, but also by international skill sets. European training, for example, often emphasizes fundamentals like shooting and passing maybe more intensely or earlier than traditional American playground culture did.
Interesting.
And you even see takes like culture critics pointing to the Golden State Warriors, partly owned by tech billionaires, right, as being heavily involved in the gentrification of basketball via stats.
Wow, via stats.
Yeah. The idea is the game is becoming a bit less playground and a bit more programmed. And that programming often benefits those who can afford that early specialized training. It feels like a consequence, maybe an unintended one, of the institutions embracing analytical models and global talent, but without a matching investment in the traditional American grassroots system that historically fostered a different kind of player, a different style.
So, okay, this raises a huge question. How are the players themselves reacting to all of this? What's the view from the court on these pretty profound shifts?
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear from them. We hear a lot from current NBA stars, actually. LeBron James, for instance. He's very vocal about youth sports burnout, about excessive structure. He's worried kids are pushed too hard too early. He even offered the kind of surprising perspective that nothing beats recess for developing young talent and creativity.
Recess from LeBron James.
Yeah, imagine that. A multi-millionaire superstar basically saying kids should ditch the private trainer and just go play. Kevin Durant has also lamented how kids don't play outside as much anymore. He notices empty outdoor courts that used to be packed, and he's been quite critical of AAU, saying it sometimes teaches the wrong lessons about teamwork and, fundamentals.
Then you have younger Black American stars like Anthony Edwards, John Morant. They play with this freer, really athletic style, kind of reminiscent of earlier eras, right?
Definitely.
And they seem aware of this shift. Like they feel they might be the last of a dying breed, acutely aware that Americans aren't automatically the top dogs anymore. Morant, notably, apparently, still plays pickup in his old neighborhood, carrying forward that tradition.
Which is powerful. And then on the international side, you hear guys like Luka Doncic and Giannis Antetokounmpo also weighing in. They acknowledge how expensive youth sports are in the U.S. Luka openly said, it's getting too expensive for some kids to even play. And he added that the pressure to be perfect can take away the love for the game.
Yeah, that fun element.
Exactly. And Giannis, you know his story, sharing shoes with his brothers growing up. He comments on how these kids get so spoiled sometimes in the U.S. system, yet maybe some lack that hunger he had. And they both highlight how European club systems often fund talented kids. The clubs invest. Whereas in the U.S., often the families bear the financial burden. That's a stark difference, driven by how the sport is organized institutionally.
Right. And what about the veterans? Guys who came up maybe 15, 20 years ago?
Yeah, players like Carmelo Anthony, Chris Paul, Dwayne Wade, they offer really powerful reflections. Carmelo, who grew up in tough neighborhoods in Baltimore, he basically said he might not have made it today because, quote, it costs too much now to do what we did for free.
Wow, that hits hard.
It does. These players, they recognize that the pipeline that produced them has drastically changed. And you see them advocating for things like free community clinics, better school programs, trying to bridge that gap.
So what does this all mean then? It sounds like the players from different backgrounds largely confirm many aspects of this gentrification narrative, right? The rising costs, the reduced access for underprivileged kids, the cultural shift away from street ball.
Yeah, they see it. They express a mix, really, of nostalgia, maybe some concern, but also hope. There's definitely competitive respect for the international talent pouring in, but there's also this palpable desire, you hear it in their voices, to keep the sport rooted in its inclusive spirit. And that seems to require deliberate effort, from the league, from the institutions, from everyone involved.
Okay, let's connect this to the bigger picture then. How are basketball's institutions actually responding to these shifts? Especially thinking about that tension investing billions overseas while the U.S. grassroots system becomes more commercialized.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe billion-dollar, given the money involved.
Huh? Yeah, probably. Culturally, it seems like there's a real concern, right? If fewer Black American youths reach superstardom, could there be a cultural disconnect? For decades, the NBA has so proudly embodied Black excellence, Black style. The league has to balance its global growth with respecting that fundamental Black American foundation.
Absolutely. It's not inherently bad for the NBA to be more international. I mean, global talent is exciting, but the league needs to be proactive, really intentional about maintaining that deep cultural connection, even as player demographics shift.
And from a purely talent perspective?
Well, globalization has clearly been a boon. It's raised the overall quality of play, drawing from billions worldwide. That's hard to argue against. The threat, if you want to call it that, is mostly to American dominance, maybe, and perhaps opportunities for what you might call marginal American players.
Meaning?
Meaning, if you're a really good player, but maybe a fringe division high night guy or a borderline NBA prospect, you might lose a roster spot to a similarly skilled international player simply because the pool is bigger now.
Right. More competition.
Exactly. It's a direct consequence of basketball's institutions prioritizing a global talent pool, which is great for the league's worldwide appeal in business, but it definitely creates more intense competition for American players. It's led some commentators to kind of muse that American youth need to catch up fundamentally.
Okay, but now here's where we see some major systemic shifts happening, right? Things that are directly addressing those economic barriers, at least at the college level.
Yes, huge changes recently. The 2021 Name, Image, and Likeness Rule, NIL, that was massive. Suddenly, college athletes could earn endorsement money. Some are making 6, even 7 figures.
Life-changing money for some.
Absolutely. And then the landmark 2025 House v. NCAA antitrust settlement went even further. It allows schools themselves to pay college athletes directly, up to a cap, roughly $20.5 million per school annually. This stuff is genuinely historic. It could potentially change millions of lives for the better.
So how does this impact the gentrification idea? Does it help access?
Potentially, yes. These reforms could increase the incentive for American kids, especially those from low-income backgrounds, to stick with basketball. College play now offers a potential paycheck, not just a scholarship. This might stem the flow of top prospects bypassing college for paying alternatives like the G League Ignite was, or overseas leagues. And the settlement also eliminates scholarship limits for schools that opt in, creating more funded roster spots overall, more opportunity.
Are there downsides, though? Could the money just concentrate talent even more at the richest programs?
That's definitely a concern. We might see the money consolidate talent at the already wealthy programs, and, maybe only a handful of superstars reap those outsized deals. Plus, those with existing privilege like a huge social media following or a famous last name like Bronny James, they might have an edge in the NIL era initially.
Right, the rich get richer, potentially.
Yeah, it's possible. But there's a strong counter-argument, too. Even a modest NIL deal, maybe a few $1,000s, can be absolutely life-changing for a kid from a poor neighborhood. It validates their skills, gives them resources, encourages them to pursue it seriously, and fundamentally, it addresses that historical exploitation where players, as someone put it, play over 10,000 hours of basketball for free under the old amateurism model. So it's a massive step by the institutions to address economic inequities.
Okay, so those are the big top-down reforms, but are we seeing anything else, like more grassroots responses, communities trying to reclaim access?
Yes, and this is really fascinating. Beyond the NCAA and NIL, we're seeing some truly innovative community-led solutions emerge, direct responses from communities themselves. One really interesting example is the No Backboard Basketball League, or NBBL. It's a blockchain project, which sounds techy, but the core idea is powerful.
On backboards, how does that work? And blockchain, tell me more.
Yeah, so the NBBL aims to address what they call the discarded community in basketball, trying to flip the script on who benefits from the game. On the court, it's a bold new version of the game, literally, no backboards and slightly smaller rims. The idea is it forces precision, emphasizes pure skill, speed, stamina, no easy layups off the glass.
Interesting. So it directly addresses that critique about fundamentals.
That seems to be the idea, a focus on pure shooting and skill. But the really game-changing part might be off-court. It's inspired by principles of community economic empowerment, powernomics, drawing from Dr. Claude Anderson's ideas. The NBVL is structured to be a community where athletes, entrepreneurs, creators, investors, they can become actual stakeholders, actual owners.
Owners.
Through, blockchain technology. Their UHoopers Society membership uses it to allow community members to gain access to content, jobs, investment opportunities, and even share in the league's future revenue. The goal is to keep the economic benefits circulating within the community rather than flowing out to distant billionaires like in traditional sports ownership. It's a fundamental shift in who profits.
So if I'm understanding this right, the NBBL isn't trying to replace the NBA or NCAA. It's more like an alternative path.
Exactly. They see themselves as a complement, not an adversary. It's about cultivating players who might otherwise quit the sport because the main paths feel inaccessible. And it's about broadening what making it in basketball even means beyond just pro leagues.
That's a really different approach.
It is. It's an active resistance, you could say, to the idea that basketball's future is inevitably less accessible or has to follow the traditional top-down model. It's a model for self-sufficiency and communal ownership within the sport, directly challenging those traditional institutional structures that have sometimes marginalized grassroots communities.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. Quite a journey. We've seen how basketball's demographics have shifted pretty dramatically in some ways, driven by these rising economic barriers in the U.S., the whole pay-to-play culture, and also the globalization that the institutions themselves have prioritized. But we've also explored these significant systemic reforms, NIL, the NCAA settlement, and these really innovative grassroots efforts like the NBBL trying to push back.
Yeah, it's definitely a nuanced reality. While that term gentrification is provocative and it highlights real issues of access and cost, globalization is also a positive expansion of talent. The game is arguably better than ever. The challenge isn't necessarily that Black Americans are being actively pushed out, perhaps, but that the pathways, especially in the U.S., have become tougher, more selective, more expensive, partly due to costs and partly due to that changing institutional focus,
Yeah.
investing heavily overseas while the U.S. grassroots became increasingly commercialized. But the good news is the conversation about these issues, it's happening now at all levels of the game, from superstars down to startup leagues. People are aware.
Ultimately, basketball is still, at its core, such a democratic game, isn't it? You just need a ball and a hoop. That simplicity is why it took root in the poorest neighborhoods and all around the world. And maybe no amount of commercialization, no matter how strong, can fully take that fundamental accessibility away.
I think that's right. The future of basketball probably isn't an either-or. It's likely a both-and. The sport can be both incredibly elite and fundamentally accessible. The challenge is how to balance that global expansion, that elite level of play, with inclusion, with making sure the institutions that benefit so much from the game also nurture its roots everywhere. The ball is quite literally in our hands, the fans, the players, the leagues, the communities, to make that happen. So maybe the question for you listening is, what stands out to you as the most important adjustment basketball needs to make to keep its soul vibrant for everyone?